Listen closely, my friends. You are going to die having given everything to people who would not spare you 5 minutes in a hospital bed. Sit with that sentence for a second. Let it actually land before you scroll past it, before your brain does what it always does and softens it into something easier to swallow. Because somewhere right now, in some kitchen, in some office, in some quiet car in a parking lot, a kind person is exhausting themselves for someone who would not do the same for them. And they call it love. They call it loyalty. They call it being a good person. The Stoics 2,000 years ago, in a world with no therapists, no self-help books, no language for burnout, had a colder, more honest word for it. They called it a slow, voluntary death, dressed up as virtue so you would never notice it was killing you. If you are the one who always answers the phone at midnight, even when your own hands are shaking, if you are the one who always says yes when your body is screaming no, when every cell in you is begging for one single day that belongs to nobody but you, if you have ever given until there was nothing left to give and still felt guilty for not giving more, then understand something clearly right now. This video is not going to comfort you. It is going to take you apart, piece by piece, the same way years of one-sided giving quietly took you apart. And then, if you stay until the end, it is going to hand you the tools to rebuild yourself into someone who can never be used like that again. Before we go further, I need you to do one thing, not for me. Hit subscribe now, because what I am about to say to you over the next hour is going to work on you slowly, the way real philosophy always does, and you are going to want more of it once your old defenses start to crack. This channel exists for exactly one purpose: to hand you the cold, uncomfortable truths that ancient philosophy has been shouting into the void for 2 millennia, truths most people are too comfortable or too afraid to actually listen to. Subscribe for the version of you 6 months from now, the one who finally stopped being everyone's emergency exit. Let's begin. There is an old Stoic exercise called the view from above. Imagine yourself rising, slowly, above your own life, above your own city, above the entire spinning earth, until every crisis you are currently drowning in shrinks to the size of a single grain of sand on an endless beach. From that height, ask yourself honestly, how much of what is currently exhausting you is actually yours to carry, and how much of it did you simply pick up because nobody else was reaching for it fast enough? Hold that question in your mind. You are going to need it for what comes next. 9 ways how kindness will ruin your life. Number 1. You will build a cathedral of expectations and watch it collapse on top of you. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man alive at the height of the Roman Empire, a man who could have had anyone on earth executed with a single gesture of his hand, woke up every single morning of his adult life and wrote himself the same brutal warning before his feet even touched the floor. He reminded himself that today he would meet the meddling, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful, the envious, and the unsociable, and that he must not be surprised by any of it, because he already, fully, without illusion, knew exactly what kind of creatures he was dealing with. You do not do this. Nobody ever taught you to do this. Instead, you give, and quietly, without ever consciously deciding to, you begin constructing something enormous inside your own mind. Brick by brick, favor by favor, sacrifice by sacrifice, late night by late night, you build a cathedral of expectation. Somewhere in that structure lives an unspoken belief, one you have never said out loud, because saying it out loud would feel needy, would feel transactional, would feel like it cheapens the purity of what you thought you were doing. The belief is simple. One day, when I am the one drowning, someone is going to pull me out the exact way I pulled them out. And then, one day, you are drowning, and nobody comes. The cathedral you spent years building in silence collapses on top of you, and the worst part, the part that will genuinely break something inside you if you let it, is that the people who do not come are not villains. They are simply people who never signed the contract you wrote for them in the privacy of your own head. Here is the cruelty hiding underneath all of it. It is not that people are secretly evil, waiting for their moment to abandon you. It is that you constructed an agreement they never actually agreed to, and then you felt betrayed when they failed to honor terms they were never shown. Epictetus, a man born into slavery, a man who was owned, beaten, and crippled by his own master, somehow became freer in his mind than the emperors who ruled over him, and he said something that should be carved into the wall of every chronically kind person's home. We suffer not from what happens to us, but from our own judgment about what happens to us. Your suffering in this specific case is not because people failed you. It is because you quietly expected other people to be you, to think like you, to give like you, to remember the way you remember. They are not you. They were never going to be you. And the sooner that fact stops feeling like a personal betrayal and starts feeling like simple, neutral information about the species you belong to, the sooner you stop bleeding out on the floor of a cathedral you built entirely with your own two hands, using materials nobody else ever agreed to supply. Think about that for a moment before we move on. A structure that took years to build, collapsing in a single afternoon, and nobody around you even noticing the sound of the fall, because to them, nothing actually happened. You simply asked for something once and did not receive it. To you, an entire private religion just crumbled to dust. Marcus Aurelius did not build his empire on the assumption that people would treat him the way he treated them. He built it on the assumption that they would not, and he trained himself daily to be unshaken by that fact, rather than repeatedly wounded by it. That distinction, the difference between expecting nothing and resenting everything, is the entire hinge this first lesson turns on. Get it wrong, and every single act of generosity you offer quietly becomes a trap you have set for your own heart without ever meaning to. Number 2, you will train the people around you to expect your disappearance from your own life. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius from what he already suspected might be the final years of his life, said that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. But buried underneath that famous line is a second, quieter, far more dangerous truth he understood just as well. We do not become what we intend to become. We become what we repeatedly do, whether we meant to or not. If you rescue someone from the consequences of their own choices one time, that is kindness. It is generous. It is human. It is admirable. If you rescue them 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, it stops being kindness and quietly transforms into a job description, one you never applied for and one that was never actually posted. And yet somehow you are the only candidate who ever shows up for the shift. You have trained them, not maliciously, not even consciously, but the way water trains stone, drop by drop over years, that whatever crisis lands in their life will, eventually, inevitably, become your crisis to solve. And once that pattern sets, something quietly terrible happens to them. They stop developing the muscle required to solve their own problems. Why would they build that muscle? You are stronger, you are faster, and most importantly, you are free, available, one phone call away at any hour of the day or night. You have built them a permanent exit ramp away from their own responsibilities, a smooth, well-paved road, and you are standing at the very end of it, every single time, waving them through with a smile that is slowly costing you everything. And here is the part that will genuinely hurt to hear. When one day, exhausted beyond anything you have language for, you finally do not answer the phone, they will not think to themselves, "She must be going through something difficult right now." They will think with real confusion, with real betrayal in their voice. Where did the safety net go? Because you were never, in their mind, a full human being with limits. You were infrastructure. And infrastructure is not thanked, not celebrated, not even noticed, until the day it finally, quietly breaks. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when someone realizes for the first time that the person they always relied on is not going to answer this time. It is not relief. It is confusion, almost betrayal, as though a law of physics had quietly stopped applying. That silence is the sound of a habit breaking, and habits, once broken, rarely reform themselves cleanly. Some of those people will grow, forced finally to build the muscle they never had to build before. Others will simply go looking for the next available exit ramp and resent you quietly for having closed the one they had grown so comfortable using. Consider, too, what this pattern actually teaches the people you love most over years, without either of you noticing the lesson being taught. It teaches them that struggle is optional, that consequences are negotiable, that someone will always appear to soften the landing, no matter how many times they walk toward the edge. You are not protecting them by doing this. You are quietly robbing them of the exact experience that would have made them capable, resilient, and whole, all while telling yourself the story that you are simply being a good friend, a good partner, a good parent, a good sibling. Number 3. Your own life will go missing and you won't even notice the exact day it left. Here is a question I want you to actually sit with, not just read past. When was the last time you did something entirely, completely, unapologetically for yourself, with absolutely no thought given to how it would serve, please, or benefit anyone else? Not a small reward you allowed yourself after a long day of caretaking, like a consolation prize handed to a child. Not a treat you felt you had somehow earned through enough suffering first. Just a thing you wanted, taken freely, without a single second of guilt attached to it. If you cannot answer that question quickly, if there is a long, uncomfortable pause where an answer should be, that silence should genuinely frighten you more than anything else in this entire video. The Stoics were relentlessly obsessed with what they called the ruling faculty, the governing part of a person's mind responsible for their own judgments, their own choices, their own inner direction. Marcus Aurelius warned himself constantly, almost desperately, against letting his own mind become, in his words, dyed by the colors of everything happening around him, against becoming so completely saturated by other people's emergencies, other people's moods, other people's endless needs, that his own inner world faded into something pale, translucent, and eventually invisible. This is precisely what happens to constant givers. It does not happen all at once, in one dramatic moment you could point to later. It happens slowly, silently, one favor at a time, until you become something closer to a hallway that other people walk through on their way to getting what they actually need. And hallways, by their very nature, do not have preferences. Hallways do not have a favorite color, a favorite Sunday morning, a private ambition nobody else knows about. Hallways simply exist to be walked through, again and again and again, until one day you catch your own reflection in a mirror and genuinely struggled to remember what you wanted before you quietly began living your entire life as a service rendered to everyone but yourself. Self-abandonment almost never feels like a decision while it is happening. That is exactly what makes it so dangerous, so difficult to catch in the moment. It never announces itself with a warning label. It arrives disguised as virtue, dressed in the language of selflessness and devotion. And by the time you finally notice something essential is missing, what is missing, quietly, patiently, entirely, is you. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how many hours you slept. It is the exhaustion of a person who has not made a single unshared decision in longer than they can remember, who cannot recall the last time a choice was made purely because it pleased them and for no other reason at all. That exhaustion does not show up on any medical chart. It shows up in the eyes, in the long pause before answering a simple question like, "What do you actually want to do tonight?" A question that, for a chronic giver, can feel almost impossible to answer honestly. Number 4. People will mistake your softness for weakness and test it accordingly again and again. This next one is going to sting, so brace yourself before you keep reading. Cato the Younger, a man so unshakably rigid in his own principles that even the enemies who despised him were forced to respect him, was never once mistaken for weak, not by his rivals in the Senate, not by the soldiers who served under him, not even by the men who ultimately conspired against everything he stood for. Why not? Because he made his boundaries unmistakably known, publicly, without hedging, and he never once apologized for having them in the first place. You, on the other hand, have probably apologized for a simple boundary before you had even finished stating it out loud, the words tumbling out, already wrapped in 3 layers of guilt and justification nobody actually asked you for. Here is a brutal truth about human psychology that almost nobody will say to your face directly, so I will say it here instead. Unconditional availability does not register as generosity to most people, no matter how pure your intentions behind it actually are. It registers, quietly and often unconsciously, as a lack of value. If a door is always open, day or night, rain or shine, nobody ever stops to wonder what might be behind it. If a person is always available, endlessly, without exception, nobody ever stops to wonder what that person might actually be worth. The moment you finally set a limit, something strange and almost immediate happens. People who never once respected your time before will suddenly, visibly, begin to respect it. People who quietly took you for granted for years will recalibrate their entire approach to you within days. Not because you became meaner, not because you became colder or harder to love, because you became a person with actual edges, actual definition, and edges are the only thing on earth that reliably tells another human being exactly where they end and you begin. Weakness is not the same thing as kindness. Weakness is simply kindness with no boundary ever attached to it. And the world, whether we like admitting it or not, has an extraordinarily accurate nose for telling the two apart, almost instantly, almost every single time. Think of the last time someone pushed a boundary of yours, quietly, testing to see if it would hold. Maybe they showed up late without warning. Maybe they asked for something they already knew was unreasonable. Maybe they simply assumed, without checking, that you would say yes the way you always had. That was not cruelty on their part. It was calibration. People are constantly, instinctively testing the edges of what they can get away with around you, the same way water tests the edges of a container. Give them no edge to test, and they will keep pouring until you overflow. There is a reason ancient Rome respected Cato, even while despising his politics. A man with unmovable principles is predictable, and predictability, strangely enough, earns a particular kind of trust that endless flexibility never can. People do not actually crave a friend who bends to every request. They crave, whether they admit it consciously or not, a friend sturdy enough to tell them the truth, hold a line, and remain standing exactly where they were the day before. Softness without structure is not comforting. It is simply unstable ground, and nobody builds a home on unstable ground for very long. We are now at the halfway point of this list, and if any single word so far has felt like it was written specifically about your own life, that is not a coincidence, and it is not flattery either. It is simply how consistent the pattern is across almost everyone who has ever mistaken constant self-sacrifice for love. Stay with me, because the next 4 ways are, in many respects, the most dangerous of all 9, precisely because they are the hardest to see happening from the inside. Number 5. You will become a magnet for the wrong people and quietly repel the right ones. There is an old idea, one the Stoics circled repeatedly without ever quite naming it the way modern language does, that we do not simply encounter people at random in this life. We attract, again and again, the exact people our current internal state is calling toward us, whether we want them or not. Marcus Aurelius said that the quality of a person's mind is shaped entirely by the quality of the thoughts they allow to occupy it. What he understood, centuries before modern psychology ever developed the vocabulary for it, is that depletion attracts depletion, exhaustion recognizes exhaustion, and need, left unchecked, will always find more need to attach itself to. When you are constantly drained, constantly pouring yourself out for others, constantly running on a tank that never gets the chance to refill, something quietly dangerous happens to your perception. You lose the ability to spot manipulation early because you are simply too tired, too depleted, too starved for a moment of ease to notice the warning signs most people would catch instantly on a good day. You become an easy target, not because you are foolish, not because you lack intelligence or insight, but because exhausted people reach for the very first hand extended to them, whether that hand genuinely intends to help or intends quietly and patiently to take. Meanwhile, somewhere on the periphery of your life, the people who actually would have matched your generosity, who would have given as freely and as fully as you do, who would have shown up without needing to be asked twice, are watching you from a respectful distance and quietly, almost sadly, concluding that you simply do not need them. You look so endlessly capable. You look so effortlessly available to absolutely everyone else around you. Why on earth would they assume, even for a second, that you might be quietly struggling too? So the takers move in close, comfortably, because you never once say no to them. And the genuinely good people, the ones who could have actually stayed, keep their respectful distance, because you never once ask them for anything at all. You end up surrounded by people who consume you and abandoned by the very people who would have actually remained had you only given them a real opening to do so. There is an uncomfortable pattern worth naming here directly. Look back honestly at the last 5 people who leaned on you the hardest. How many of them ever once asked how you were doing and actually waited long enough to hear the real answer? Not the automatic answer, the polished one you give without thinking, the real one. If the number is low, that is not a coincidence, and it is not bad luck either. It is the predictable result of a system you built without realizing you were building it. Number 6. You will mistake depletion for purpose, and that mistake is exactly how addiction quietly begins. This is the one people least want to hear, so please listen closely to this section in particular. Seneca warned that nothing is ever enough for the person to whom enough has always felt like too little. But there is a mirror version of that warning that applies with brutal precision here. Nothing ever feels like enough to a person whose entire sense of worth has become dependent on what they can provide to everyone else around them. When your sense of purpose becomes entirely, exclusively built on being needed, on being useful, on constantly filling other people's gaps and absorbing other people's chaos, you quietly create a hole inside yourself that no amount of constant giving can ever actually fill, because giving was never designed to fill that particular kind of hole in the first place. Human beings cannot survive purely on the act of providing for others, no matter how noble that provision feels in the moment. There is a private hunger, quiet and persistent, that no external act of service, no matter how selfless, can ever fully satisfy. And a private hunger, left unspoken, unexamined and unmet for long enough, eventually goes looking somewhere else for relief. A drink after a long day spent pouring yourself into everyone else's crises. A second drink, because the first one worked exactly as promised. A habit that begins innocently as relief and slowly, almost invisibly, hardens into dependency. Food eaten not out of hunger, but out of exhaustion. Money spent not out of need, but out of a desperate craving for a few minutes where nobody on earth needs anything from you at all. Anything, quite literally anything, that offers even a brief window of not being needed. If someone who genuinely loves you gently points this pattern out to you, your first instinct will almost certainly be defensiveness, an immediate insistence that you are fine, that you have always been fine, that they simply do not understand the pressure you are under. But the people closest to you, the ones paying real attention, usually see the pattern taking shape long before you are ready or willing to acknowledge it yourself. Pay close attention when they speak to you about this. They are not attacking your character. They are trying, often clumsily, often imperfectly, to reach you before the hole inside you gets any deeper than it already is. Ask yourself, honestly, what you actually feel in the 10 minutes immediately after everyone else's crisis has finally been resolved. Not relief. For a great many chronic givers, it is something closer to emptiness, a strange flatness where purpose used to be. Because the emergency that gave your day its shape and meaning has ended, and nothing yet has arrived to replace it. That emptiness is not a flaw in your character. It is a signal, and signals that go unanswered long enough will eventually get answered by something far less healthy than a phone call to a friend. This is precisely why so many endlessly generous people secretly, unconsciously prefer chaos to peace. Peace has no role for them to fill. Peace does not need rescuing. And a person who has built their entire identity around being needed can find quiet, ordinary calm to be surprisingly, almost unbearably uncomfortable, because it forces them to sit with a version of themselves that has not been defined by usefulness for even a single afternoon. Number 7. Your generosity will be treated with suspicion instead of gratitude more often than you would ever expect. This is perhaps the cruelest irony hidden within all 9 of these, so let it fully land before you move past it. We live in an era so thoroughly accustomed to transactional relationships, so deeply conditioned to expect something in exchange for everything, that genuinely unconditional kindness has quietly become suspicious by default, almost everywhere you go. Diogenes, the philosopher who famously lived inside a barrel and mocked kings openly to their faces without a shred of fear, once wandered through a crowded marketplace in broad daylight, holding a lit lantern above his head, searching, he told anyone who asked, for a single honest man. He never found one he considered worth stopping for. That search took place well over 2,000 years ago. Human nature, uncomfortably, has not improved nearly as much in the meantime as we would all like to believe. When you help someone without an obvious, visible motive attached to it, most people do not respond with, "How refreshing, how rare." They respond, often silently, often behind your back, with, "What does this person actually want from me?" Your kindness gets quietly interrogated. Your motives get privately investigated by people who simply cannot imagine generosity existing without some hidden angle, because they themselves have never once given anything away without expecting a return on it. This is not, however, a reason to become cold, guarded, or cynical yourself. It is a reason to become discerning instead. Real kindness does not require an audience to validate it, and it certainly does not need to spend its limited energy convincing suspicious, transactional people of its own purity. Let the suspicious remain suspicious. Save your energy, your warmth, your generosity for the people who have already proven, through their own actions, that they understand the difference between genuine generosity and quiet strategy. It is a strange, almost absurd position to find yourself in, being quietly punished for the very thing you were taught your entire life to believe was your greatest strength. But this is exactly why discernment matters so much more than blind generosity ever could. Kindness offered without any judgment attached to it is not virtue. It is simply an open door with no one standing guard, and eventually someone who should never have been let in is going to walk straight through it. Number 8. You will delay your own grief for so long that it eventually arrives all at once and nearly destroys you. Nobody talks about this one nearly enough, and that is exactly why it belongs here, near the end of this list, where it can do the most damage to your comfortable assumptions. When you spend years absorbing everyone else's crises, comforting everyone else's losses, holding steady space for everyone else's pain without complaint, something quietly happens to your own unprocessed grief in the meantime. It does not simply disappear because you were too busy to attend to it. It waits, patiently, silently, accumulating interest in a room you never open. Marcus Aurelius wrote his most private reflections during a devastating plague that killed members of his own family, all while commanding armies on distant frontiers, all while governing a vast empire teetering on the edge of collapse. Even he, a man forced to process almost unbearable personal loss in real time, while the entire world demanded his constant attention elsewhere, understood clearly that grief deferred does not simply vanish with time. It compounds quietly in the dark, waiting for its moment. If you have spent years being the strong one, the one who shows up at every funeral holding everyone else together while quietly falling apart on the inside, the one who never once gets the chance to collapse because someone always needs you to remain the sturdy one in the room, then understand this clearly. Your own losses are sitting somewhere inside you right now, in a room you have not opened in years, unaddressed, unexamined, and steadily accumulating interest with every single day that passes. One day, often triggered by something disproportionately small, a door left carelessly open, a particular song playing unexpectedly on the radio, a stranger's small kindness arriving at exactly the wrong, most vulnerable moment. All of it arrives at once, without warning, without mercy. Years of postponed mourning collapsing violently into a single unbearable afternoon that you never saw coming. This is not weakness, no matter what your inner critic tries to tell you in that moment. This is simply the bill finally, inevitably coming due for a debt you never should have been carrying entirely alone in the first place. Ask yourself something uncomfortable right now. When was the last time you were allowed to simply fall apart, without immediately reassuring the people around you that you were fine, that they did not need to worry, that you would handle it the way you always handle everything? If you cannot remember, that absence is not evidence of your strength. It is evidence of a debt quietly compounding, one that will eventually be collected, whether you have prepared for it or not. Grief that is never given room to exist does not politely wait forever. It leaks. It shows up as irritability toward people who did nothing to deserve it, as a strange heaviness on ordinary mornings, as a tiredness that no amount of sleep ever seems to touch. The body remembers what the schedule never allowed the mind to process, and it will keep sending reminders in increasingly loud and inconvenient ways until someone finally listens. Number 9. You will quietly forget who you actually are underneath all the giving you have done. And here, finally, we arrive at the deepest wound hidden within this entire list. Epictetus taught that we must constantly ask ourselves a simple, disciplined question. What is actually mine to control, and what is not? But there is a harder, far more uncomfortable question buried underneath that one, a question most endlessly kind people never once allow themselves to ask directly. Who am I exactly when I am not actively performing usefulness for someone else's benefit? If you were to strip away every single role you currently play, the fixer, the listener, the reliable shoulder, the one who always without fail shows up, what would actually remain underneath all of it? For a great many chronically kind people, the honest, uncomfortable answer is silence. Not because there is genuinely nothing there underneath, but because that particular part of them has not been fed, nurtured, or even acknowledged in so long that it has gone quiet, patiently waiting somewhere inside to be remembered again. This is the final and arguably the most dangerous consequence of unregulated giving. It is not simply that you eventually run out of money or energy or time, although you absolutely will run out of all three, given enough time. It is that you slowly, almost imperceptibly, stop being a person with your own rich interior world, your own private ambitions, your own quiet preferences, and instead become a function that other people simply organize their entire lives around. And a function, no matter how deeply beloved, no matter how essential it appears to everyone around it, is simply not the same thing as a self. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism itself, is said to have built an entire philosophy out of a single shipwreck that cost him everything he owned. He did not respond to that loss by giving away what little remained of himself to soften other people's disasters. He responded by asking, patiently, methodically, what was actually left standing once everything external had been stripped away. That question, asked honestly, is the only real cure for the 9th way kindness will ruin your life. Not less giving, not colder giving, just a self solid enough underneath it that giving no longer costs you your own name. Now, before this gets any heavier than it already has, let's talk seriously about how to actually fix this. Because awareness without concrete action is nothing more than a slightly more articulate form of ongoing suffering, and you did not sit through all of this just to feel understood. You came here, whether you realized it consciously or not, to actually change. Here are 4 tough, deliberately uncomfortable strategies, straight from Stoic practice, to stop people from taking advantage of you ever again. Strategy 1. Treat your own discomfort as sacred, non-negotiable data. Your body keeps a ledger that your mind is often far too polite to actually check. The Stoics believed relentlessly in the discipline of daily self-examination, in ending each day with a brutally honest accounting of their own internal state, without flinching, without softening the truth. So begin doing this yourself, starting tonight. When you feel resentment quietly creeping in after helping someone, do not swallow it down the way you always have. Interrogate it directly. Resentment is not a character flaw you need to feel ashamed of. It is information, precise and reliable. It is your own nervous system sending you an itemized invoice for something you gave away freely, without ever being paid back in the specific currency that actually mattered to you. Keep a simple record for 1 week, nothing elaborate. Just a note each time you feel that familiar tightness in your chest after saying yes to something. You will likely be shocked at how quickly the pattern reveals itself once you actually start looking for it on paper, instead of letting it dissolve back into the noise of a busy life. Strategy 2. Make the word. Know a complete sentence, one you are fully allowed to say without a eulogy attached to it. You do not owe anyone on this earth a 3-paragraph justification for the simple act of protecting your own time. Practice saying the word out loud, alone in your own home, until it finally stops feeling like you are committing some kind of crime against another person. No is not the ending of a relationship, no matter how much your anxiety insists otherwise. It is very often the true beginning of a real one, because any relationship that cannot survive a single honest boundary was never actually stable to begin with. It was simply convenient for them and expensive for you the entire time. The first few times will feel unbearable. Your voice may even shake. That is not a sign you are doing it wrong. That is simply the sound of an old, worn pathway in your brain being rerouted for the first time in years, and every uncomfortable repetition makes the next one measurably easier. Strategy 3. Guard your own hours the way you would instinctively guard a sleeping child in a dangerous room. Whatever genuinely restores you, whether that is silence, movement, a good book, a long walk with absolutely no destination in mind, schedule it as though it is completely unmovable. Because to everyone circling your available time like hungry birds, it needs to be treated exactly that way. If someone asks for your help during that specific window, you are fully allowed to protect it without guilt, without lengthy over-explanation, and without a single word of apology attached. People will only ever treat your time as negotiable for as long as you personally allow them to. Notice, too, how differently people respond once that window becomes non-negotiable in your own mind first. Boundaries are rarely actually broken by other people. They are broken far more often by the boundary setter quietly deciding, in the moment, that this one exception does not really count. Strategy 4. Learn to recognize the people who feed quietly on your exhaustion and walk away without waiting around for permission. Some people, no matter how much you help them, do not actually want your help at all. They want your energy indefinitely, with absolutely no intention of ever changing a single thing about their situation. You will learn to recognize them through one simple, reliable test. Nothing you ever offer them actually helps, because their ongoing crisis is not a problem they genuinely want solved. It is a role they have built their entire identity around, and solving it would mean losing themselves. Trying desperately to rescue someone who needs their own catastrophe more than they need an actual solution is not compassion, no matter how it feels in the moment. It is a slow, quiet, exhausting form of self-harm, and you are fully, completely allowed to stop. You do not need their permission to step back, and you certainly do not need a dramatic final conversation to justify it. Distance, quietly and consistently maintained, is often the entire message, and it is a message that requires no further explanation to be complete. In the end, the Stoics never once asked us to stop being kind altogether. That was never the lesson, and anyone who tells you it was has misunderstood the entire philosophy. They asked us, instead, to stop being kind without discernment, to stop confusing self-erasure with virtue, to finally understand that the middle path, the carefully measured path, the path walked by a person who gives generously but never emptily, is the only version of kindness that can actually survive sustained contact with a world that will happily take everything you allow it to take from you. Give too little, and you become someone nobody particularly wants near them. Give without any limit whatsoever, and you disappear entirely, one quiet favor at a time, until there is genuinely nothing left standing where a whole, complete person used to be. The wisest people who ever walked this earth did not force themselves to choose between kindness and self-respect, as though the two things were natural enemies locked in permanent conflict. They understood, clearly and completely, that those two things were never actually opposites to begin with. They were always meant to be the exact same practice, two hands belonging to the same body. Think back one last time to that image from the very beginning of this video, the cathedral built quietly out of expectation, favor by favor, sacrifice by sacrifice. You do not have to tear that cathedral down completely. You simply have to stop building it alone, in silence, out of materials nobody else ever agreed to supply. Build something smaller instead. Something honest. Something with a door you get to choose who walks through, and a foundation strong enough to hold your own weight first, before it is ever asked to hold anyone else's. So the next time you feel that familiar, powerful pull to abandon yourself entirely for someone else's momentary comfort, I want you to remember the one word that has apparently gone quietly missing from your vocabulary for far too long. No, say it now, quietly, wherever you are, just once. Notice how strange it feels, and notice too that the world did not end the moment you said it. That is the whole lesson, distilled into a single syllable you were always allowed to use. And if anything in this video reached something real inside you, if even a single sentence made you sit up a little straighter in your chair, do not let this simply end here and fade by tomorrow morning. Subscribe right now, because the version of you who finally, fully protects their own peace deserves to keep hearing this message again and again in as many different ways as it takes, until it finally, permanently sticks.